Hey guys, tonight we are going to immerse ourselves in one of history's greatest and most tragic love mysteries. Who truly captured the heart of King Henry VIII? 6 wives, 3 named Catherine, 2 beheadings. The story of this notorious king and his scandalous marriages always ends with one question. Who was the favorite? You would definitely think of Jane Seymour. She fulfilled the highest duty, giving birth to the male heir. She was solemnly buried next to the king. Many history books have called her the only wife Henry truly loved. But I tell you, that is only half the truth. What if we ignore the assumptions written after death, and instead focus on the very actions, the cruel choices that Henry made during his life? Henry VIII went through 3 transformations, from the romantic prince to the desperate monarch, and finally to the suffering tyrant. Each person within him demanded a different kind of love. There was only one woman who met and understood all 3 versions of this Henry. That story is not in the school textbooks. It is depicted through Henry's own life. And once you understand this, you will never look at the 6 wives through the same lens again. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Before we begin our journey to find the one who captured Henry's heart, let me know, where are you right now, and what is your local time? I always like to imagine our community relaxing together from all over the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Oh, Henry VIII, arguably the most formidable monarch in English history, yet equally notorious, led a life defined in part by his 6 marriages, of which 2 wives were condemned to the block, and 1 consort was burned at the stake. Among these, Jane Seymour's name shines most brightly in popular memory. She alone bore him a son, Prince Edward, and was granted the singular honour of a final resting place beside him at Windsor Castle. Generations have recounted that Jane was Henry's true wife, the one who fulfilled his deepest longing for a male heir, and then departed this world before giving him cause for disappointment. But can such assumptions be trusted? The quiet tragedy of Jane Seymour represents only the opening chapter in the quest to discover which wife truly captured the heart of Henry VIII. To understand the complexities of his affections, we must recognize that Henry lived 3 distinct lives. Asterisk young Henry, the romantic prince, whose days were filled with music, dancing, and amorous adventure. Asterisk middle Henry, the desperate king, willing to shatter the authority of the Roman Church and dissolve its monasteries in his quest to win the love of a new wife. Asterisk old Henry, the aging tyrant, racked by a festering leg ulcer and a host of ailments, longing for peace before his final breath. Each version of Henry craved a different shape of love, and so the perfect queen would need to understand all 3 facets of his soul. Yet rather than rely on hearsay or popular legend, we must look to his concrete actions, the only true measure of the king's feelings toward his consorts. The opening salvo in this story came in May of 1536. Mere days after Anne Boleyn's blood still stained the crimson cloth of Tower Green. Exactly 10 days following Anne's execution, Henry arranged a private wedding to Jane Seymour. There were no grand processions, no public celebrations, only the king and his new bride, exchanging vows amid a court reeling from religious and political upheaval. Henry at that moment was exhausted, spent by the drawn-out divorce from Catherine of Aragon, beleaguered by conflict with the Pope, and burdened by factional strife within his own council. He sought only a woman who could restore calm to his tempest-tossed life. Jane Seymour did not engage in political debate, nor did she challenge the king's authority as Anne Boleyn had done. She simply inclined her head, offered a gentle smile, and uttered a soft yes to every request Henry made. The court received her as a soothing breeze after a violent storm, for Jane embodied a serenity and sweetness that had been absent since the royal household had been rent by intrigue and schism. Yet beneath Jane's seeming simplicity lay a profound surprise. She delivered the precious son Henry had yearned for. On October 12th of 1537, after 3 days of arduous labour, Prince Edward was born. The joy of that moment soared to the highest peaks of triumph, only to be shadowed by tragedy. Jane held her newborn once, perhaps twice, before a devastating fever seized her. She passed from this world exactly 12 days after giving birth. Henry's response to Jane's death revealed far more about his heart than any declaration ever could. He orchestrated the most magnificent funeral accorded to any of his wives. The entire court donned black for months. Princess Mary served as chief mourner, and the king himself retreated from public life, genuinely grief-stricken. When Henry later commissioned the design of his own tomb, he insisted that his sarcophagus lie directly beside Jane's, an unprecedented choice. Given that Catherine of Aragon had shared his bed for 24 years and Anne Boleyn had altered the course of the nation, Jane had resided with him for only 16 months, yet she alone merited that eternal proximity because she died before she could ever fail him. Those actions laid bare Henry's true measure of devotion. But the tale does not end with Jane's sorrowful demise. Hidden beneath the quiet pathos of Jane Seymour's story lies the presence of another wife, one who perceived the full spectrum of young Henry, middle Henry, and old Henry. It is she who ultimately commands the title of the woman Henry VIII loved above all others. And so, the journey of revelation continues, beyond the tragic legend of Jane Seymour, toward the heart of the king himself. The death of Jane Seymour marked far more than a private sorrow. It opened a new chapter, revealing the truest depths of Henry VIII's heart. The moment Jane drew her final breath, the royal court was swallowed by mourning. For months on end, every member of the Privy Chamber and the King's Council donned sombre black. Princess Mary, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, was appointed chief mourner, her tears and laments echoing through every vaulted hall, a poignant reminder of the Queen's gentle grace. Meanwhile, Henry withdrew from public ceremonies, retreating to the silent chambers of Whitehall, where the weight of grief pressed upon him like a shroud. The solemn funeral took place in early winter of 1538, in a ceremony unrivaled in splendour or solemnity. Jane's coffin lay upon a black velvet-draped bier, its edges trimmed with gilded carvings of crowned initials and Tudor roses. The cortege proceeded slowly from the Chapel Royal, through Whitehall's horse-carpeted courtyard to Westminster Hall, where the hungry chill of approaching winter seeped between stone pillars. Drumbeats steady as a funeral march reverberated through the air, interwoven with the mournful calls of cornet that drifted like forlorn birdsong. Above, swathes of ebony cloth hung from rafters, and flickering candles burned without cease, their subdued glow casting elongated shadows along the marble floors. In Westminster Hall, Thomas Cranmer, Archbishop of Canterbury, delivered the eulogy. Queen Jane was not merely the mother of our sovereign's heir, but the very breath of this realm's hope. His words resonated with those present. Jane was immortalized not by lineage alone, but by the quiet constancy of her service and the purity of her devotion. Courtiers, noblemen, and ladies-in-waiting alike stood transfixed, many pressing handkerchiefs to tear-streaked faces as the Archbishop spoke of Jane's virtues, her gentle obedience, and her willingness to bear the heaviest burden of childbirth for the crown. Then came January of 1540, when Henry himself re-emerged from seclusion to preside over the final committal. Gone was the regal bearing that once defined him. In its place, a gaunt figure with reddened eyes trudged slowly up the stone steps, each footstep echoing like a confession. As Jane's coffin was lowered to rest at St. George's Chapel, Windsor, Henry paused at the edge, head bowed in a moment so intimate and private that few present dared to glance. That single act, his kingly posture, crumpled in genuine anguish, spoke more eloquently than any royal proclamation. Jane Seymour was the one queen who had truly broken the impenetrable armour of his heart. A decade later, Henry undertook the design of his own tomb at Sion Abbey, a project of monumental scale and lavish detail. In his hand-drafted plans, two sarcophagi would lie side by side, his and Jane's. Laurel wreaths and symbols of resurrection were etched into the stonework, but neither Catherine of Aragon nor Anne Boleyn received such honour. By this singular choice, Henry proclaimed to posterity that Jane's memory alone would endure at his side, a testament that transcended political alliances or religious upheaval. If power grants immortality, then Henry's actions ensured that Jane Seymour would live eternally in his heart. He preserved her name unsullied, the queen whose gentleness was perfection in its fleeting moment, departing before flaw or human frailty could tarnish the ideal. The sumptuous funeral rites, his withdrawal from courtly life, and the intimate decision to lie beside her in death together form the clearest proof. For Henry VIII, Jane Seymour was that final, tranquil breath, peace incarnate he had long yearned for. Yet the tragedy of Jane Seymour, is but the opening stanza in the longer epic of Henry's search for the wife he loved most. Beyond the grief and grandeur of her funeral awaits another figure, a queen who came to understand every hue of the king's complex soul, young Henry's ardour, middle Henry's desperation, and old Henry's weariness, and who, by doing so, compelled him to transcend the limits of power and passion alike. In the hush that follows mourning, the story presses onward, toward the woman whose empathy bridged all three versions of Henry and earned her the crown of his deepest affection. Anne Boleyn, the woman who ignited both a religious revolution and Henry VIII's most scorching passion, arrived upon the English court like a sudden gale. The year was 1526, and Henry was 35 years old, having been wed to Catherine of Aragon for 17 years. Anne returned from the French court bearing neither the ravishing beauty of myth nor the timidity expected of court ladies. Instead, she possessed a razor-sharp intellect and an unflinching resolve to say no to a king who was unused to denial. When Anne first stepped into the royal presence, she did not assume the customary role of ornament or footnote. She wove an allure that no woman before her had achieved. When Henry earnestly petitioned her to become his mistress, much as he had done with her sister, the erstwhile Mary Boleyn Anne resolutely refused. When he pressed jewel-studded gifts upon her, she promptly returned them. When he penned flowery love letters, she answered in clever riddles, forcing him to toil for each sweet syllable. Her defiance transformed pursuit into ardour. For 7 long years, Henry wooed her with an intensity unmatched in Tudor annals. That pursuit demanded unprecedented acts. It led Henry to divorce Catherine of Aragon in 1533, thereby severing ties with the Roman Church. He dissolved more than 400 monasteries, seized their vast lands, and negotiated alliances with the Duchy of Cleves, all as a grand declaration that the crown itself could bend to the desire of a single heart. On a cold winter's day at Whitehall Palace, he finally wed Anne, completing a saga of tension and longing that would forever alter the religious landscape of England. Anne rewarded Henry's devotion not with a son, but with a daughter. Princess Elizabeth was born on September 7th, 1533, a child whose ultimate destiny would eclipse even those of her half-siblings. Yet Elizabeth's birth did not dampen Anne's influence. Letters preserved in the royal archives reveal a Henry who cast off regal pretenses in private. In one such missive he wrote, "I beseech you earnestly to let me know your whole mind as to the love between us." Never before had an English king confessed such unguarded hunger for affection. Those intimate lines, penned in Henry's own hand, underscored the depth of his obsession. But the conflagration of love naturally gives rise to embers of conflict. Anne's sharp wit and growing political clout began to chafe against Henry's sense of absolute authority. By 1536, the king grew weary of Anne's enthusiastic debates and her refusal to toe the line of unquestioning obedience. The very qualities that once enchanted him, her intelligence, her spirit, her refusal to submit, now threatened to undermine the monarchy's unbending power. In that fraught moment, love and crown collided. The charges brought against Anne were grave: adultery and high treason. The trial at Westminster Hall was swift and severe, a spectacle of Tudor justice. On May 19th, 1536, Anne Boleyn was led to the scaffold on Tower Green. A hush fell over the assembled court as the executioner's axe fell, severing both head and hope. Anne's final breath, drawn in the cold spring air, marked not merely her end but also the tragedy of a king's broken heart. Yet love, once lit, can never be truly extinguished by steel. Decades later, historians uncovered a letter written by Henry in the aftermath of Anne's death. In it, he admitted that the time spent with Anne Boleyn was the happiest he ever knew with any woman. No such confession exists for any of his other wives. Those poignant words, written by a king famed for his pride, reveal that Anne remained the flame he could not forget, even as he remarried to secure new alliances or tender peace for his battered pride. Thus, Anne Boleyn's legacy endures not only in the religious reformation she helped set in motion, but also in the indelible mark she left on Henry's soul. She was the woman who made the sovereign forsake papal authority, the mother of a ruler who would shape the Elizabethan age, and the singular paramour who commanded a king's heart. Though her head lay severed from her shoulders, her spirit lived on in the letters she inspired and the crown she unwillingly transformed. In the quiet aftermath of her execution, when courtly pageantry resumed and Henry's gaze turned to new brides, Anne's name persisted as if his heart remained tethered to the echo of her defiant no. And it is to Anne that we must look to understand the fiercest and truest love of Henry VIII, one that refused to be bound by piety or politics, one that blazed brightest in the tumult of a turbulent reign. Anne Boleyn, the woman who kindled a fierce blaze of passion within Henry VIII's heart, was at once the brilliant light that revealed his capacity for love and the inescapable shadow that swallowed his reason. When Anne first stepped onto the stage of the Tudor court, she did more than enchant a king. She toppled centuries of tradition. After 17 years of marriage to Catherine of Aragon, Henry repudiated his long-standing wife, shook the very foundations of allegiance to Pope Clement II, and ordered the dissolution of more than 400 monasteries across England. His final act was to sever ties completely with the Roman Church. Declaring himself supreme head of the Church of England, each move made for a single, unyielding purpose: to win Anne's heart. For 3 fleeting years as queen, Anne did not merely occupy a throne. She reignited Henry's youthful ardour. In her presence he forgot the weight of crown and sceptre, and remembered the thrill of being a man in love rather than a monarch in power. Anne's courage to stand as an equal, her willingness to challenge doctrine and court politics, bestowed upon Henry the exhilarating conviction that love might triumph over any institution. She spoke frankly in council chambers, debated theology with bishops, and walked the palace corridors not as a mere ornament, but as an active participant in shaping policy. In private correspondence letters now preserved in the royal archives, Henry addressed Anne with tender epithets such as "my sweet sovereign" and "my guiding star," pleading, "Let me know your whole mind, that I may live and die by your love." These notes laid bare Henry's transformation. He exchanged regal formality for the urgent, pleading voice of a lover. Yet the same qualities that ignited Henry's devotion would soon become the very tinder that consumed their union. By 1536, the relentless scrutiny of Anne's influence and her unbridled intellect began to threaten Henry the King. He, who once celebrated her defiance of papal authority, now chafed at her insistence on having a voice equal to his own. In his mind, the queen who would not bow was a danger to the sanctity of the crown. Middle Henry, the desperate, power-weary monarch, craved a consort who would not question his decrees or stir the turbulent waters of court intrigue. Anne's refusal to conform became, in his eyes, an intolerable menace to the realm's stability and to his supreme authority. The fatal accusation came swiftly. On May 19, 1536, Anne was formally charged with adultery and high treason, a lethal combination that sealed her fate. Her trial at Westminster Hall lasted but a few days. The verdict was predetermined by the very force of Henry's displeasure. Taken to Tower Green in the chill of spring, she faced the executioner's block with unflinching dignity. The blade fell, and Anne's blood stained the grass beneath her feet. Drumbeats of mourning echoed through the city, drowning out any recollection of the joyous music that once heralded her arrival. In that moment, Henry VIII, the sovereign of the mightiest kingdom in Europe, had ordered the death of the woman who had made him feel most alive. Yet even death could not extinguish Anne's legacy. In the hushed corridors of Whitehall and the candlelit chapels of Hampton Court, whispers of her defiant spirit lingered. Chroniclers noted that those who had watched Anne's trial spoke in awed tones of her bravery, her sharp wit, and the indelible mark she left on the king's soul. Decades later, scholars uncovered Henry's personal letters, in which he acknowledged Anne as the source of his deepest joy and his greatest sorrow. No other queen, before or after, had drawn such candid emotion from him. To contemporaries and posterity alike, Anne Boleyn came to symbolize the boundless, sometimes destructive power of love. She was the spark that ignited a religious revolution, but also the flame that consumed her own life. Her influence shaped the destiny of England, from the dissolution of monastic lands to the birth of Elizabeth I. Yet above all, she demonstrated that true love demands equality, and that when that equality challenges the mightiest throne, even a king may wield the sword of justice against his own heart. In the stillness that followed her execution, the Tudor court would never forget the radiance Anne brought to Henry's life, nor the darkness that followed. And so her memory endures, a living testament to the paradox of passion. The very fire that illuminates can also cast the deepest shadow. Immediately after the tragic end of Anne Boleyn, Henry VIII moved swiftly into a fourth marriage, not one born of ardour, but forged from political necessity. In the winter of 1540, the king concluded a marriage treaty with the Duchy of Cleves, seeking a staunch Protestant ally amid mounting tensions with the Roman pontiff. The formal agreement, signed on November 16, 1539, promised Henry both safety in international affairs and the hope of securing his realm against papal influence. Yet when the day of union arrived, romance was not on the king's agenda. The marriage ceremony took place at Greenwich Palace on January 16, 1540, under the ostentatious gaze of Europe's most lavish court. Golden coaches, resplendent with glass windows and gilded mountings, conveyed the bride through cheering crowds. A sumptuous banquet followed, tables groaning beneath cold turkeys, minced tarts and spiced wine. A troupe of Flemish dancers took the floor, their steps precise and spirited, while musicians on vaulted balconies played lilting airs on viols and shawms. Though the spectacle dazzled every eye, the king's own reaction was far from joyous. Henry, expecting a vision of radiance to match the portrait painted by Hans Holbein the Younger, instead beheld a queen of modest bearing. Anne of Cleves stood before him in gowns of crimson and ermine, her expression reserved, her stature unassuming. She offered a curtsy, then waited as the king's gaze swept over her. The first chords of expectation faded, replaced by a silence heavy as winter's dusk. Not a trace of the fervent affection Henry had known with Anne Boleyn, nor the gentle comfort he had found in Jane Seymour, stirred in his heart. The contrast struck him sharply. Here was no partner in passion, no ally in warmth, only a dutiful princess bound to him by paper and promise. In the ensuing months, Henry grew ever more certain that this union would serve neither his spirit nor his state. At Westminster, he petitioned Parliament to declare the marriage null and void on the grounds that Anne had not fulfilled the required standard of royal beauty. The process unfolded with characteristic Tudor efficiency. The Act of Annulment of the marriage of the King's Highness was introduced in June and passed on July 9, 1540, formally dissolving the alliance. No blood was spilled, no scaffold awaited Anne. Instead, Henry moved with expedience to protect her dignity and safeguard the political ties he had coveted. Bestowing upon her the title, the King's beloved sister, he granted Anne a generous annual income of £2,000, 14 manors, and multiple estates that stretched from Kent to the Midlands. She retained the honours of a princess and was free to reside at Richmond Palace or Chelsea Manor as she chose. Her life after annulment was one of comfort and respect, confirming that Henry, though quick to jettison the marriage, was not a king who delighted in cruelty when utility alone was the issue. This 6-month union exposes the cooler currents running beneath Henry's search for alliance. When love failed to fulfill intangible needs, whether the exhilaration of Anne Boleyn or the placidity of Jane Seymour, the king would not hesitate to invoke the full weight of regal authority. Yet, by preserving Anne's reputation and providing for her security, he also exhibited a measure of magnanimity, distinguishing political calculation from vindictive cruelty. In the hush that followed, Anne of Cleves lived out her days in relative tranquillity, maintaining a friendly correspondence with the court and even attending royal functions. She never again faced the ignominy of trial or bloodshed. Instead, she became an emblem of pragmatic union, a marriage that made no claim on the heart but taught Henry a bitter lesson. Political expediency, however necessary, could never substitute for emotional resonance. Where Anne Boleyn had illuminated the realm with the fire of forbidden desire, and Jane Seymour had offered a fleeting balm of domestic serenity, Anne of Cleves stood as a study in controlled diplomacy. Her marriage to Henry VIII left no scandalous echoes, but it imprinted upon the king's legacy the stark truth that power alone cannot compel affection. No treaty, no lavish procession, and no act of parliament could manufacture the spark of genuine love. Thus, in the quiet aftermath of this ill-fated alliance, Tudor chronicles record not a grand romance but a sober reckoning, that the heart's deepest needs often defy the calculations of statecraft. Anne of Cleves departed Henry's life with her honour intact, her coffers full, and her name spoken without malice, reminding all who witnessed that sometimes the most enduring legacies are those written not in passion's smoke, but in the deliberate ink of political necessity. Barely had the dust of Anne of Cleves's quiet political divorce settled before Henry VIII discovered a new spark of vitality in Catherine Howard Anne Boleyn's vivacious niece when he married her in the summer of 1540. Catherine was scarcely 19 years old, her youthful glow and innocent beauty, a stark contrast to the worldly queens who had come before. To Henry the embattled, Middle Henry, whose heart still nursed wounds of theological schism, she seemed the embodiment of renewal, a fresh breeze through the corridors of power that had grown stale with intrigue and compromise. The wedding at Hampton Court Palace was a spectacle of Renaissance pageantry. Gilded carriages rolled across the courtyard, their velvet cushions pressed by noble guests, while long tables groaned under the weight of roasted swans, sugar sculptures, and imported spices. A troupe of Flemish musicians filled the grand hall with sprightly tunes, and English minstrels answered with lilting ballads that raised glasses in honour of the young bride. Catherine, dressed in a gown of cream-coloured satin embroidered with pearls and emerald thread, appeared radiant as she processed past tapestries woven with biblical scenes. Courtiers whispered that in those first golden days Henry's laughter returned like a long-forgotten melody. For Henry, Catherine was the personification of restorative love. She danced as if every step were a promise, and in her light-hearted banter he heard echoes of his own youthful abandon. The weighty solemnity that had defined his relationship with Anne of Cleves vanished, replaced by an effervescence reminiscent of the court's halcyon beginnings. Dark rumours of dissenting preachers and political rivals faded into the background as the palace thrummed with joyous revelry. In Catherine's presence, Henry dared to believe that the crown might again serve both throne and heart. Yet beneath the veneer of merriment lay concealed shadows. Catherine's past, so eagerly hidden, soon crept into the light. Investigations revealed that she had engaged in secret liaisons before her marriage, notably with Francis Dereham, a former tutor, and later with Thomas Culpeper, a gentleman of the Privy Chamber. These whispered scandals were seized upon by factional courtiers, who painted Catherine's youthful indiscretions as treasonous affronts to the dignity of the monarchy. In their telling, a queen who once laughed and danced in the great hall was now a traitor wearing a too bright smile. Henry, aged 49, his body weakened by chronic leg ulcers, and the stinging realization that political machinations lurked, even in his most intimate relationships, found himself unforgiving. To him, the Queen's betrayal transcended personal hurt. It threatened the very sanctity of the Tudor succession. A monarch who had once dissolved hundreds of monasteries and defied the Pope now saw his own household as a bastion to be protected at all costs. Thus it was that, in the bleakness of late 1542, Catherine Howard's glittering chapter came to a sudden and tragic end. Summoned before a court convened at Hampton Court Chapel, she faced charges of adultery and high treason. The verdict was swift, the outcome inevitable. On February 13th, 1542, Catherine was led to the scaffold on Tower Green. The bright banners that had once fluttered in her honour were replaced by the stark black of mourning, and the cornet's jubilant notes gave way to tolling drums. With the final falter of her breath beneath the executioner's axe, the tapestry of youthful promise unravelled abruptly, leaving behind only the echo of a life lived too swiftly. Catherine's downfall served as a bitter parable of passionate youth, burning bright but all too easily consumed. Her execution rattled the court, silencing laughter and extinguishing the illusions of carefree love. Yet even in death, Catherine Howard imprinted herself on Henry's heart. He mourned not only a queen but also the fleeting joy she had given him, the sense that he too might be young again. For a brief, shining moment, she had reminded him that beneath the weight of crown and country, he remained a man capable of feeling, of delight, and of sorrow. In the quiet hush that followed Catherine's passing, as courtiers whispered of scandal and power, the tragic romance lingered like a distant, haunting refrain. Henry would wed again, seek new alliances, and further consolidate his authority, but none would bring the same intoxicating blend of innocence and ardour that Catherine had embodied. And so, amid the mournful tolling and the cold stone of the tower, the memory of Catherine Howard stood as both cautionary tale and bittersweet reminder that love, in its brightest bloom, can wither swiftly, and that the most exquisite passions are often the most perilous. Catherine Parr, the sixth and final wife of Henry VIII, entered his life during the waning days of the monarch's reign. By July of 1543, Henry was 52 years old, his once mighty frame burdened by a chronic leg ulcer that throbbed with relentless pain, and his spirit frayed by 5 tempestuous marriages. In contrast to the women who had gone before, Catherine was not merely famed for her beauty. She was an erudite scholar, fluent in 3 languages, an author of devotional texts published under her own name, and a respected intellectual in courts across Europe. Their wedding ceremony took place at Hampton Court Palace on a summer's day in July of 1543. The king, a figure more accustomed to stern proclamations than displays of affection, presented Catherine with a simple gold ring engraved with the words, "I love," a rare emblem of his enduring trust and personal regard. Where Jane Seymour had offered gentle acquiescence and Anne Boleyn had challenged his will, Catherine engaged him as an equal. In private audiences, she questioned him on theological matters, debating scripture and doctrine with a confidence that took the court by surprise. This unprecedented intellectual partnership breathed new life into Henry's old Henry persona, revealing a softness long buried beneath the weight of the crown. In 1546, Catherine's inquisitive nature drew her into a perilous controversy. She had exchanged letters and books with leading figures of the Protestant Reformation, an activity that alarmed the conservative faction at court. Rather than allow these courtiers to move against her in secret, Catherine took the bold step of seeking out the king directly. She travelled from her apartments to Henry's staterooms, meeting his gaze without flinching, and explained that her discussions were driven purely by a thirst for knowledge and profound respect for his wisdom. Moved by her candour and courage, Henry tore up the arrest warrant that had awaited her signature and publicly reaffirmed his confidence in her judgment. This act did more than spare Catherine from imprisonment. It demonstrated that Henry valued honesty and valour above rigid orthodoxy. Catherine's influence extended far beyond theological debate. When Henry departed for his military campaign in France, he appointed her Regent Queen of England, entrusting her with the full responsibilities of government. She presided over the Privy Council with poise, managed state affairs, and safeguarded the realm's stability. More tenderly, Catherine took charge of the education and well-being of Henry's children, Prince Edward, Princess Mary, and Princess Elizabeth, mending rifts that had long divided them. Under her care, Edward's tutelage flourished, Mary's rightful status was restored, and Elizabeth found in her a maternal figure who nurtured her intellect and spirit. For the first time in years, the royal household experienced a fragile harmony. Henry's final days revealed the depth of his esteem for Catherine. On January 23, 1547, he passed away at Whitehall Palace, leaving behind a king's bounty for his last queen. Catherine received an annual pension of £7,000, along with multiple estates and jewels, a testament to Henry's desire to secure her comfort beyond his death. Rather than fade into obscurity as a forlorn widow, Catherine continued to live as a woman of independent means. She remarried Thomas Seymour, Lord High Admiral, forging a new partnership that reflected her enduring spirit of inquiry and compassion. Catherine's own life concluded on September 8, 1548, when she succumbed to complications following childbirth. She was interred with full honours at St. Mary's Church in Chelsea, where mourners remembered her not merely as a queen but as Henry's final confidant, his true partner in both governance and gratitude. Historians note that no other Queen of England has commanded such posthumous respect. Catherine Parr is celebrated not simply for surviving Henry's tumultuous court, but for shaping a legacy of learning, reconciliation, and steadfast friendship. Through Catherine Parr, Henry VIII's quest for love found its ultimate fulfillment. He had chased the fervour of youth, the solace of obedience, and even the sharp edges of political alliance, but it was Catherine's blend of intellect, honesty, and empathy that granted him the enduring peace he longed for in his twilight years. Their marriage closed the 6-act drama of his romantic life with a gentle coda, in which the once-feared tyrant king discovered the quiet triumph of being truly understood. In Catherine Parr's companionship, Henry at last laid down the crown's burdens and found a sanctuary for his wearied heart, a testament to the power of respect, shared wisdom, and unwavering devotion. When one surveys the 6 marriages of Henry VIII, from the fierce passion of Anne Boleyn to the serene devotion of Jane Seymour, the calculated alliance with Anne of Cleves, the fleeting fervour of Catherine Howard, and the intellectual partnership of Catherine Parr, it becomes clear that Henry's pursuit was never merely for eternal love. Instead, he sought reflections of his own shifting self through each queen, as though each marriage were a mirror held to a different facet of his soul. In the era of young Henry, He was captivated by beauty and challenge. Anne Boleyn awakened in him the heady taste of freedom and the intoxicating surge of youthful power. At 35 years old, he had grown weary of convention, and Anne's razor-sharp wit and refusal to submit transformed him from a dutiful son of Catherine of Aragon into a man ready to shatter religious bonds for love. Then came Middle Henry, the desperate king battered by political storms. In Jane Seymour, he found the gentle haven he craved, peace after tempest. Her 16-month tenure as Queen Short though it was brought him the air he yearned for, and a calm he had never known. Anne of Cleves, by contrast, stood as a stark lesson in realpolitik, a marriage negotiated for Protestant alliances but swiftly discarded when it lacked emotional resonance. Catherine Howard, at just 19 years of age, rekindled his younger self's vitality in a dazzling flash of youth, only to extinguish it just as quickly in a tragic downfall. Finally, in Old Henry, the aging tyrant nursing his chronic leg ulcer and the fatigue of 5 failed unions, Catherine Parr appeared as a steadfast companion. More than a mere consort, she became regent queen while Henry campaigned in France, presided over the Privy Council, and nurtured his 3 children. In her, he discovered the rare gift of true understanding, a mind equal to his own, and a heart compassionate enough to mend the fractures of his fractured household. Through these 6 wives, Henry VIII's actions, not his declarations, reveal his truest confessions of love. He did not simply proclaim, "I love you." He realigned the course of English Christianity to win Anne Boleyn's hand. He designed his tomb to lie beside Jane Seymour. He annulled the arrest warrant that threatened Catherine Parr. Each gesture, each decree, spoke volumes more than any verse of poetry ever could. From this tapestry of Tudor romance, one discerns that Henry did not love according to the dictates of tradition. He loved according to his need. The need to be challenged by Anne Boleyn's defiance. The need to find solace in Jane Seymour's quiet grace. The need to wield political leverage through Anne of Cleves. The need to taste the exuberance of youth with Catherine Howard. And the need for an intellectual equal in Catherine Parr. His heart was a compass, continually seeking a true north amidst shifting desires. Thus, the truest wife cannot be the one who shared his bed the longest, nor the one who bore him the most children, but the one who comprehended every shard of his evolving identity. She was the queen who first ignited his romantic idealism, the one who granted him unbroken serenity, and the one who honored his intellect when his body and crown faltered. This was not merely the center of a chapter in Henry's romantic saga, but the embodiment of understanding that elusive treasure the king pursued above all else. And so, through the lens of 6 marriages, we find that Henry VIII's journey was less about finding eternal love than about discovering himself reflected in the eyes of these 6 remarkable women. Their stories converge on a single truth. The ultimate love Henry sought was the love that could see him fully, his youthful ardor, his desperate ambition, and his age-worn vulnerability, and still choose to remain by his side. For in that final profound act of understanding lay the quiet triumph Henry VIII had longed for amid crowns and conquest. Now, as we reflect upon the sequence of 6 marriages that defined Henry VIII's tumultuous reign, one truth emerges unmistakably. For Henry, love was not a soulmate's embrace, nor a mystical bond that held hearts captive. Instead, love served as a mirror reflecting his most intimate needs, his drive for power, his craving for challenge, his yearning for peace, and ultimately his desire for intellectual companionship. With Anne Boleyn, Henry became a young man possessed by passion's flame. He was willing to sever ties with the Roman Church and dismantle centuries-old religious structures simply to pursue that spark. Born of a union in September of 1533, Elizabeth Tudor would eventually reign as one of England's greatest monarchs. But in the moment of Anne's ascent, Henry was the embodiment of young Henry, a sovereign determined to assert his identity and taste freedom's edge. Yet passion alone could not sustain him. Enter Jane Seymour, whose gentle demeanour offered Henry the solace he sought after years of courtly storm. On October 12, 1537, Jane gave birth to his long-desired male heir, Prince Edward. In those 16 months they spent together before Jane's untimely death on October 24, 1537, Henry tasted a profound calm. He became Middle Henry, the desperate king desperate for stability, for the simple rhythm of family life unmarred by theological conflict. When that calm proved fragile, Henry turned to Anne of Cleves in January of 1540, a marriage arranged not for romance but for political expediency. The Duchy of Cleves promised Protestant allies in the fractured landscape of European power, and so Henry engaged in a marriage that was, at root, an exercise in diplomacy. Within 6 short months, disappointment led him to seek annulment under the assertion that Anne lacked the beauty expected of a queen. The swift dissolution revealed the king's capacity for ruthlessness when practical concerns outweighed personal sentiment, a stark testament to the Tory caution that guided his court. Yet the quest for emotional renewal continued. Catherine Howard, just 19 years old, stepped into Henry's life in the summer of 1540, igniting a brief but fervent renaissance of youth. Her laughter and liveliness stirred a longing in middle Henry to feel alive again, to taste the simple joys long since banished by age and obligation. But youthful impetuosity bore bitter fruit. Catherine's past affairs with Thomas Culpeper and Francis Derham led to her execution on February 13th, 1542, reminding Henry that impetuous desire could exact the harshest of prices. In the final act of his marital drama, Henry found in Catherine Parr an intellectual companion worthy of his years. Married in July of 1543, Catherine was no mere ornament. She was a scholar fluent in 3 languages, a published author, and, when Henry travelled to France in 1546, his appointed regent queen. Under her stewardship, the kingdom's affairs ran smoothly. The education of Edward, Mary, and Elizabeth advanced, and the fractured Tudor household mended its wounds. Catherine Parr invited Henry into late-life conversations on theology and statecraft, and in turn he rewarded her candour by tearing up an arrest warrant that might have condemned her on charges of Protestant sympathy. Thus unfolded the symphony of Henry's romances, with each queen representing a distinct movement in his life's composition. The passionate allegro of Anne Boleyn, the lullaby adagio of Jane Seymour, the pragmatic moderato of Anne of Cleves, the vivace vivacity of Catherine Howard, and the reflective andante of Catherine Parr. Only by embracing every tempo, romance, despair, pragmatism, youthful exhilaration, and thoughtful companionship, could Henry grasp the full measure of love's possibilities. If one asks, which wife did Henry VIII love most? The answer will not be found in the length of her tenure, nor the number of children she bore. Rather, the answer lies in whose presence induced Henry to reshape the realm, to cradle his grief, to test the bounds of his power, and to entrust his crown to another. It was not merely the queen who made him happiest, but the queen who gave him the strength to act beyond all previous limits, from severing ties with the Pope to designing a peaceful burial beside Jane, from annulling marriages to granting regency to Catherine Parr. In the final analysis, it appears that Catherine Parr, the woman who comprehended all 3 faces of Henry, young, romantic, desperate sovereign, and aging monarch, emerged as the embodiment of complete love in his eyes. She honoured his youthful ardour with respectful curiosity, soothed his middle years with steadfast counsel, and rewarded his final chapter with genuine friendship and intellectual equality. In understanding every facet of Henry's being, Catherine Parr fulfilled the true essence of love: to see another wholly and choose to remain by their side. In that enduring choice lies the quiet triumph Henry VIII sought but rarely found, the profound peace of being understood without surrendering the self. So, when we set the 6 marriages of Henry VIII side by side, we find more than a series of romantic tragedies. We uncover the portrait of a king's heart, one perpetually torn between personal longing and sovereign duty. The final question remains: which wife truly captured Henry VIII's heart? Catherine of Aragon taught him an early lesson in loyalty and honour. Married in June of 1509, she bore him Princess Mary in May of 1516, but never gave him a son. 17 years of steadfast devotion could not bridge the gap between duty and dynastic necessity. Catherine's unwavering faith shaped Henry's understanding of fidelity and prepared the stage for his first great rupture with the Church. Then came Anne Boleyn, who incited him to break with Rome, dissolve over 400 monasteries, and challenge the Pope's authority. Her fierce independence and intellect awakened young Henry's thirst for freedom and self-assertion. Yet her refusal to submit ultimately drove him to condemn her for treason on May 19, 1536, culminating in her execution at Tower Green. Anne's defiance both saved and shattered him. She was the flame that burned brightest, then scorched the edges of his heart. Jane Seymour, his third queen, brought relief a haven of peace amid the storm. On October 12, 1537, Jane gave birth to Prince Edward, delivering the male heir Henry had so desperately sought. Her gentle compliance and maternal grace soothed the middle Henry, who yearned for stability after years of religious and marital upheaval. Yet, Jane's life was fleeting. She died on October 24, 1537, leaving Henry to mourn the calm that vanished far too soon. The fourth marriage, to Anne of Cleves, was a political test rather than a love match. Sealed in January of 1540, it aimed to secure Protestant alliances amid Edward Seymour's machinations on the continent. When Anne failed to match the painted portrait Henry had admired, he sought an annulment within 6 months, citing her unmeet countenance. The swift dissolution of that union demonstrated Henry's ruthless pragmatism. When political expediency outweighed personal affection, he would sever ties without hesitation. Into this tapestry burst Catherine Howard, a 19-year-old spark of youth married in the summer of 1540. She rekindled Henry's sense of vitality. Her laughter and beauty awakened the king to joys long buried. But her past dalliances with Thomas Culpeper and Francis Dereham became accusations of infidelity and treason. Catherine's execution on February 13th, 1542 revealed the price of impulsive passion, a brilliant flame swiftly extinguished, leaving only regret in its wake. Finally, Catherine Parr emerged as the harbourward anchor for an ageing tyrant. Married in July of 1543, she brought not only compassion, but intellectual kinship. Fluent in 3 languages and an author in her own right, she became regent in 1546, governing in Henry's absence and uniting his children Edward, Mary, and Elizabeth under her watchful care. In Catherine's steadfast companionship, Henry found the rarest solace, genuine respect and shared inquiry. When he died on January 23, 1547, he provided her with a generous pension of £7,000 per year, estates and jewels, ensuring she would live independently until her own death on September 8, 1548. If love can be measured in deeds rather than declarations, then Henry's truest confessions lie in his actions. The schism with Rome for Anne Boleyn, the splendid funeral and tomb beside Jane Seymour, the annulment of Anne of Cleves' marriage, and the pardon of Catherine Parr's supposed heresy. Through each he invested his full royal authority in the woman who fulfilled his present need, whether for challenge, tranquility, strategy, rejuvenation, or understanding. With Catherine Parr, Henry discovered a lasting love not born of beauty or political calculation, but of mutual esteem and intellectual harmony. She served as regent, guided his heir's education, and stood as the final companion of his storied life. In her, he found peace without sacrificing himself, a testament to the power of respect and empathy. Yet this story does not end here. Those of you watching from beyond the shadowed halls of history are invited into the final contemplation. If you must choose, which of Henry VIII's 6 wives deserves the title of his truest wife? And what does that choice reveal about your own understanding of love, loyalty, and identity? In that question lies the true legacy of Henry's marriages, not in who he wed, but in why he loved. And now, having explored the 6 turbulent marriages of Henry VIII, we embark on a new journey, the relationship between the formidable king and his children. His 6 wives shaped every phase of his soul, yet it is a father's love that reveals his most humane and vulnerable side. In the moments to follow, we will examine which of his 3 heirs, Mary, Elizabeth, or Edward Henry, loved most, how he strove to build their legacies, the storms that tested his bonds with his princesses, and, ultimately, the emotional inheritance he left them. And now, let us turn the spotlight to the father-son relationship between Henry and Prince Edward, the vital thread of succession that the king so painstakingly wove. Edward Tudor was born on October 12, 1537, at Hampton Court Palace, ushering in a brilliant new hope for the Tudor dynasty. The infant prince, swaddled in red velvet blankets beneath the glow of flickering candles, and heralded by triumphant trumpets, stirred in Henry's heart a pure, unguarded joy. That son, the long-desired male heir, was not only the embodiment of royal authority, but also a rare testament to the king's deep paternal affection. When Jane Seymour died on October 24, 1537, Henry plunged into profound grief. Yet the newborn Edward's first cries soothed his pain, prompting the king to withdraw from courtly duties for many weeks to remain at his son's side. Edward's presence reassured Henry that, however precarious the throne might be, his responsibility and love for his child held the power to heal every wound. Henry's devotion quickly translated into action. He entrusted the care of the young prince to Thomas Wriothesley, Lord Chancellor, and later added Edward Seymour, Earl of Hertford, as regent. He also summoned two of England's most eminent scholars, John Cheke and Roger Ascham, to instruct Edward in Latin, Greek, Roman history, and music. During twilight lessons by candlelight, father and son would sit together, solemnly reciting poetry, creating a scene at once dignified and deeply tender. Education was not Henry's only concern. In 1540, as a smallpox epidemic ravaged London, the king ordered the construction of a separate suite of lodgings at Richmond Palace to shelter Edward from contagion. Royal medical records record that, amid the outbreak, Henry spared no expense, spending thousands of pounds sterling to safeguard his son. The royal physicians conducted daily health checks, and no visitor could see the prince without explicit royal permission, underscoring the depth of Henry's anxiety and his desperate desire to preserve Edward's precious life. The next pivotal moment was the Act of Succession of 1546, in which Henry formally named Edward the sole heir after Mary and Elizabeth. He appointed the Earl of Hertford as Lord Protector and Guardian of the realm until Edward reached maturity. On February 20th, 1547, Edward VI's coronation took place at Westminster Abbey. Though only 10 years old, the prince wore the imperial state crown with solemn confidence, amid the peals of celebratory drums and thunderous applause. The bond between father and son deepened through private correspondence. In one letter, written when Edward turned 10, Henry admonished, "Keep your heart tender, just, and brave, as I have long counselled." Another, sent on the prince's 12th birthday, instructed, "Always be prepared to shoulder sword and sceptre, but never forget your duty to your people." Signed simply, "Your father." These words were more than political guidance. They were a father's heartfelt legacy to his son. Although Edward VI lived only until the age of 15 and died on July 6, 1553, the spiritual inheritance Henry bestowed upon him endures. During Edward's brief 6-year reign, he relied upon the educational foundation and paternal confidence his father provided as he advanced religious and cultural reforms. The image of the prince studying by candlelight at his father's side, or the orphaned boy awaiting word from his ailing father, remains etched in history as proof of a seldom seen Henry VIII. That behind the iron facade of England's most formidable monarch lay a father who worried deeply and loved boundlessly. And now, let us shift our focus to the complicated bond between Henry and his firstborn, Princess Mary, a relationship marked by both deep affection and painful estrangement. Princess Mary Tudor arrived on February 15th, 1516, at Greenwich Palace to widespread celebration, the cherished daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon. For nearly 17 years, she held the proud position of sole heir, her early life filled with tutors who taught her French, Spanish, theology, and music, while court festivities honoured her as a beloved princess. Henry himself took a personal interest in her upbringing, commissioning lavish gowns and inviting her to sit at his side during state banquets, revealing a rarely seen tenderness beneath his formidable exterior. All that changed in 1533, when Henry's marriage to Catherine was annulled. The Act of Succession stripped Mary of her legitimacy and confined her to the austere chambers of Kimbolton Castle. Once the life of courtly revels, she became Lady Mary, cut off from the world she knew. In handwritten letters smuggled from her isolation, she confessed, "Though I suffer, I remain your true daughter," showing that her love for Henry endured despite the political storm. Henry's treatment of Mary vacillated between cold formality and reluctant care. He barred her from public ceremonies, yet continued to send gifts, a yearly allowance of silk fabrics, devotional books, and, when illness struck in 1535, a royal physician to attend her bedside. An invoice records the delivery of emerald brooches, accompanied by Henry's note, "Receive these tokens as proof of my ongoing concern." Though the gestures were impersonal, they carried a measure of paternal worry. In 1543, the Second Succession Act paradoxically restored Mary's place after Edward and before Elizabeth, though reconciliation remained tentative. Upon her return to court at Hampton Court, courtiers clad in black bows greeted her quietly. Henry, now 52 years old, and beset by persistent ulcer woes, watched from his throne and presented her with a pearl-encrusted brooch, whispering that it signified renewed favour. Mary accepted the gift, interpreting it as a small but significant overture of restoration. Henry's final act of parental devotion appeared in his will, drafted in November of 1546. He explicitly named Mary second in succession and bequeathed to her estates at Kensington and Hatfield House, ensuring her security. He stipulated that no harm shall come to my daughter Mary, a clause witnessed by the Lord Protector, Edward Seymour. These provisions, penned in the king's own hand, stand as the ultimate gesture of a father seeking to protect his daughter's future. Despite this legal restoration, Mary felt the lingering pain of earlier rejection. At court entertainments, she watched dances from the sidelines, her composure laced with melancholy. In private, she expressed joy at reconciliation, yet her letters betray enduring sorrow. My heart still yearns for the warmth of paternal approval unclouded by politics. This formative experience influenced her later reign as Queen Mary I, where her devotion to Catholicism and stern measures against dissent were shaped by her profound sense of betrayal and desire for legitimacy. Mary's story lays bare Henry VIII as both a ruthless monarch and a father with conflicted loyalties. He could remove her status yet restore it. He could condemn her mother and yet send tokens of care. His actions, like those toward each of his 6 queens, spoke louder than any proclamation. A sovereign whose quest for heirs split a nation, yet whose final efforts strove to heal one broken relationship. In Mary's steadfast loyalty, even amid humiliation, we witness the enduring power of a father-daughter bond, battered by ambition but never fully broken. And now, let us turn our attention to the complex relationship between Henry and his second daughter, Princess Elizabeth, a bond of light and shadow that would shape England's future. Elizabeth Tudor was born on September 7th, 1533, at Greenwich Palace, the second child of Henry VIII and his second wife, Anne Boleyn. Her arrival was celebrated as the dawn of a new era, an era shaped by her mother's influence and her father's royal ambitions. From her earliest days, Elizabeth captivated the court with her bright eyes, quick mind, and instinct for courtly diplomacy. Tutors taught her Latin, French, music, and philosophy, while courtiers whispered that she might one day eclipse even her half-brother, Edward. Yet Elizabeth's infancy was shadowed by scandal. Just 3 years later, in May of 1536, her mother was executed under charges of adultery and high treason. Elizabeth, at not quite 3 years old, was declared illegitimate and removed from the line of succession. The child who had once been the pride of Anne's brief queenship found herself ostracized, sent to live in the care of distant relatives at Hatfield House. Letters from Elizabeth's own hand, penned decades later, recall waking to empty rooms and walls that once rang with royal voices, now silent a formative loss of mother and status that would haunt her throughout her life. Henry's treatment of Elizabeth vacillated between suspicion and affection. In 1538, he allowed her to return to court under strict supervision, installing her in rooms adjacent to his own. Yet she remained under the eye of critics who watched her every move, assessing whether she would conform to the new Protestant order. Despite these constraints, Elizabeth flourished intellectually. She mastered Greek and Italian, studied theology, and composed poetry that circulated in secret among trusted courtiers. Her resilience in adversity endeared her to many, including her father, though he rarely displayed overt affection. The turning point came in 1546, when the Third Succession Act was passed. Henry restored Elizabeth to the line of succession after Mary, affirming in his own hand that all former judgments and proclamations against her shall be void. This act of legal restoration coincided with a rare moment of personal outreach. The king summoned Elizabeth to his bedside during his final illness in January of 1547. Though weak from illness, Henry addressed her with surprising warmth, urging her to be steadfast in faith and to govern wisely if called upon. These private words, recorded by his physician, reveal a fleeting but genuine paternal concern. Elizabeth's complex feelings toward her father are evident in her later reign. As Queen Elizabeth I, she often referenced her position as Henry's daughter, his light through the storm, while asserting her independence. In early-year court masques, she donned the Tudor rose alongside the portcullis badge, symbolizing unity. Yet her policies, moderately Protestant, pragmatically tolerant, reflected the political caution she learned in her father's shadow. Henry's emotional legacy for Elizabeth can also be seen in the cultural patronage she embraced. She championed the arts and established the Royal Library initiatives that echoed the educational environment Henry had fostered. In her famous Tilbury speech of August of 1588, she evoked her father's protective role. "I have but the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king." That speech, resonant with Tudor symbolism, underscores how deeply her father's example shaped her approach to rulership. Ultimately, Henry VIII's relationship with Princess Elizabeth illustrates the dual nature of his paternal influence. A love tainted by political expediency and scandal, yet grounded in moments of genuine concern and high expectation. She emerged from the shadows of her father's reign to illuminate the throne with a golden age of exploration, culture, and relative religious peace. In doing so, Elizabeth fulfilled the promise Henry saw in her as a child, proof that even amidst betrayal and exile, the spark of royal lineage can shine brightest when tempered by adversity and guided by a steadfast, if complicated, father's hand. And now, as Henry VIII contemplated his mortality, he crafted a final testament that wove together his emotional and political legacies for Edward, Mary, and Elizabeth. When the king put quill to parchment in November of 1546, he not only settled the line of succession but also endeavoured to safeguard each child's future according to their unique needs. For his son, Edward, Henry's will reaffirmed the young king's status as sole heir and entrusted him to the care of Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, as Lord Protector. The document stipulated that Somerset shall have full authority to govern and guard our realm in our son's name until he shall come of lawful age. Moreover, Henry bequeathed to Edward the incomes from Hampton Court, Windsor Castle, and other premier royal estates, an unambiguous guarantee of the financial resources the boy would require to rule effectively. In Mary's case, the will represented a dramatic reversal of policy. Once declared illegitimate in 1533, Mary was restored by name to the succession immediately after Edward and before Elizabeth. Henry granted Mary the revenues of Kensington, Hatfield, and Highgate manors, ensuring she would never again depend solely on court favour. The king's own handwriting added that he bore lasting affection for Mary, an understated but sincere acknowledgement of the daughter he had once set aside. He also entrusted her spiritual education to Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, underscoring a final vote of confidence in both Mary and the Reformed Church he had established. For Elizabeth, Henry's final provisions recognised her restored status after Mary. He endowed her with the former estates of Anne Boleyn and Anne of Cleves, symbolically linking her to both his most passionate and his most pragmatic marriages. To prepare her for leadership, he appointed Sir William Cecil, his most trusted counsellor, as her chief tutor and adviser. By conferring her to Cecil's guidance, Henry signalled his belief in Elizabeth's intellect and prudence, hoping she would emulate the stability and moderation his reign so often lacked. These carefully calibrated bequests, however, were more than legal technicalities. They were personal gestures from a father seeking to atone for past mistakes. Henry recognised Edward's vulnerability as a child king, Mary's long years of exile, and Elizabeth's precarious legitimacy. In addressing each heir's circumstances, granting robust guardianship for Edward, financial security for Mary, and mentorship for Elizabeth, he sought to compensate for the emotional and political wounds his earlier choices had inflicted. The practical outcomes of these provisions shaped England's trajectory. Under Somerset's regency, Edward VI pressed forward with Protestant reforms in line with Henry's earlier break from Rome. Mary, empowered by her restored status and estates, ascended as Queen Mary I with a determination fueled by both personal vindication and religious conviction. Elizabeth I, guided by Cecil and buoyed by her father's endowments, navigated a careful middle path that led to the Elizabethan Golden Age. Yet beyond politics, Henry's will stands as a deeply human document, a monarch's final embrace of his children. In his last letters, penned mere weeks before his death on January 23, 1547, Henry reminded Edward to rule with mercy and courage, urged Mary to uphold her faith with dignity, and counseled Elizabeth to balance strength with wisdom. Though he wielded the power to destroy monasteries and dissolve marriages, in these closing lines he revealed a father's tender care and profound hope for his legacy. Thus, Henry VIII's final will transcends its role as a dynastic charter. It is a father's valedictory, a blending of statecraft and love that sought to equip Edward, Mary, and Elizabeth, not only with crowns and lands, but also with the assurances and guidance necessary to carry forward the Tudor name. In the end, it was Henry's most enduring act, to unite his shattered family under provisions of law and tokens of affection, ensuring that even when his own reign had ended, the bonds of blood and the power of his paternal love would endure. And now, as night settles and the candle in the study has long since guttered out, let us drift our spirits back through the 6 brilliant, tempestuous loves of Henry VIII, and onward into the poignant father-child bonds with his 3 beloved offspring, Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward. From Catherine of Aragon, who taught him the lessons of fidelity and honour, to Anne Boleyn, the flame of ambition that awakened young Henry to break the church. From Jane Seymour, the haven of peace for middle Henry amid the storms, to Anne of Cleves, the pragmatic lesson in politics. Then Catherine Howard, the burst of youthful joy that quickly faded, and finally Catherine Parr, the soulmate who embraced both tempests and tranquility in the heart of old Henry. Those 6 queens once held Henry's heart through every phase: his thirst for liberty, his longing for serenity, his calculation of power, his exhilaration of youth, and his yearning for intellectual harmony. And then his 3 children: Edward, the heir born of tears and hope; Mary, the princess exiled then graciously restored; and Elizabeth, the princess of light who triumphed over the wounds of her birth, revealed the most humane and vulnerable side of the iron-faced king. The message that remains after those marriages, those wills, and those private letters is not one of power or throne, but of understanding. Only when he was truly understood by a wife who chose to remain, by a child who looked into his eyes, did Henry find peace and press onward. Actions, not words, revealed his truest love. Breaking with Rome to follow Anne, building a tomb beside Jane, rescinding the arrest warrant for Catherine Parr, or drafting a will to secure Edward, Mary, and Elizabeth's futures. As the final images of endurance and sacrifice fade, we feel the warmth of love not confined to titles of queen or inheritance, but radiating through care, whispered messages, and every small decision of a king's heart. And now, gently relax your shoulders and let your mind drift to a place of peace, free from yesterday's worries. Let love and understanding guide you into dreams, where all anxiety dissolves, leaving only the soft echo of history's whispers. Sleep well, dream sweetly, and keep your heart warm. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you won't miss our latest videos where we explore the most emotionally rich and valuable stories of history.